Isolde had never bowed to anything in 9 years on that farm, not to a bucket of grain, not to a stranger, not even to Emory Castellan on the day he pulled her out of a kill pen in Danville with her ribs showing through her coat. So when he stepped out onto the porch that November morning and saw her folded down in the wet grass along the north fence line, front legs tucked beneath her like a horse bowing to a king, his first thought was that she was dying. His second thought, the one that got him moving before his boots were even laced, was that she would not stop making that sound low in her chest, over and over, aimed at something in the grass he could not yet see. He would tell people later that he ran the whole 200 yards. He would not tell them that halfway there, he already knew, in the part of a man that knows things before his mind agrees to know them, that it was not colic, and it was not a snake bite, and it was not anything a horse had ever bowed to before. What he found under Isolde's lowered head, wrapped in a man's flannel shirt gone dark with dew, was a baby, small enough to fit inside his 2 spread hands, still breathing, but barely, her lips gone the pale blue-gray of a Kentucky dawn in late fall. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain what happened in the next 4 minutes, and he would never fully manage it, because the truth was that he did not decide to pick the baby up so much as his arm simply did it, while the rest of him was still catching up. And Isolde did not move, did not spook, did not do any of the 100 things a half-done animal with a fresh stranger scent in her nose might reasonably do. She watched him lift the child out of the wet, and only then did she rise, slow, deliberate, like something releasing a duty she had been holding by herself in the dark. What Emory did not know yet, could not have known standing there in the grass with a stranger's baby freezing against his chest, was that the horse would do it again. Not once, not twice. 9 more mornings in the exact same spot, long after there was nothing left there for her to bow to at all. That was the part of the story nobody in the county could explain, and it was the part that would keep him up at night, long after the baby was safe, warm, and named. Emory Castellan was 61 years old and had lived on that 140 acres outside Willow Creek his whole adult life, first with his wife Marielle, then for the last 2 years without her. He ran what the county called a horse rescue, and what he privately thought of as a retirement home for animals nobody else had wanted enough to keep. 6 horses grazed his back pasture that November. Only one of them had ever made him nervous in the particular way Isolde did, and it wasn't fear. It was the sense, which he'd never said out loud to another living soul, except maybe to Marielle's grave, that the mare was paying closer attention to the world than a horse had any right to. He'd bought her, if you could call $400 and a promise buying, from a kill buyer's lot 8 years back. A bay mare with a torn ear and a belly still slack from a foal she was never allowed to raise. The paperwork said she'd lost the foal in a difficult birth on a breeding operation 2 states over, though the vet who examined her later had his doubts about how much of that story was true and how much was. The kind of things sellers say to make a broken-down horse sound like a tragedy instead of an inconvenience. Whatever the truth was, Isolde came to Willow Creek with a habit of standing at the fence line for hours some evenings, facing nothing in particular, and with an odd, specific tenderness toward anything small and helpless that crossed her path. She'd once spent 3 days refusing to leave the side of an orphaned barn cat kitten, too young to survive on its own, standing guard over it in the hay, the way another horse might guard a foal, until the kitten was old enough to fend for itself, and wandered off without a backward glance. Emory had thought it was sweet at the time. He had not thought much more about it than that. Marielle had been the one who noticed it first, actually years before any of this. She used to say Isolde had the look of a mother who'd been robbed of a job and never quite stopped applying for it. Emory hadn't thought much of the comment at the time either. He thought of it constantly now, in the 2 years since the cancer took Marielle in 11 quiet months. because it was the kind of thing his wife had always seen before he did, the soft undercurrent running beneath an animal or a person that took him years longer to notice, if he noticed it at all. He still caught himself some mornings walking toward the house to tell her something about the horses, before he remembered there was no one in the kitchen to tell it to. The farm had gotten quieter in ways that had nothing to do with sound. That was part of why the baby unsettled him so completely, in a way he didn't examine too closely at first. A house that had gone silent in one particular register, the register of small voices and small feet, had a child in it again, however briefly, however much that child belonged, by every legal and moral measure, to somebody else. He noticed, riding behind the ambulance that first morning, that some part of him was already grieving the fact that he would eventually have to hand her back. The morning of the baby, before any of it happened, had started ordinary enough that it barely deserved the word morning. Frost on the windshield, coffee gone lukewarm before he finished his first cup, a weather report predicting a hard freeze that night, the kind that made him double-check every water trough on the property out of habit, because Marielle used to be the one who remembered things like that. And 2 years hadn't been long enough to stop feeling the gap where her half of the chores used to live. He'd heard Isolde before he saw her. Not a whinny. Something lower, more guttural. A sound he associated with mares and hard labor, though Isolde hadn't been bred in the 8 years he'd owned her, and had no business making that sound at all. The ambulance took 11 minutes to reach the farm, which Emory would later be told was fast for that stretch of county road, and felt, at the time, like 11 hours. He rode in the front of his own truck behind it, the whole way to Willow Creek Regional, because nobody had told him he couldn't, and because leaving that baby to travel to the hospital without a single familiar face behind her felt, in that moment, like a thing he was constitutionally incapable of doing. The nurses called her baby girl Doe on the paperwork. Emory, without really deciding to, started calling her Wren, after the 2 birds he'd watched, building a nest in the fence, post not 4 feet from where he'd found her, a detail that struck him as either meaningless or the opposite of meaningless, and he genuinely could not have told you which. She weighed 5 pounds 2 ounces. The pediatrician on call estimated she was no more than 2, maybe 3 days old, and that she'd likely been outside, exposed to the cold, for at least 6 or 7 hours before Isolde found her, possibly longer. He used the word miracle without seeming to notice he'd used it, then caught himself and switched to a more careful phrase, favorable circumstances, which fooled no one in the room. By that evening, Sheriff's Deputy Garrett Voss had walked the entire fence line twice with a flashlight and come up with exactly nothing. No car tracks on the gravel turnout half a mile down the county road. No footprints that held their shape in the frost-hardened mud. No note, no bag, no diaper. Nothing but a 5-pound baby in a shirt 3 sizes too large for anyone who might have carried her. What Garrett Voss said to Emory that night, standing by his cruiser with his breath fogging in the cold, was that whoever left that baby either knew exactly what they were doing, choosing a spot close enough to a house with lights in the windows and horses that would raise a fuss, or they hadn't known anything at all, and the whole thing had happened by accident of geography, a person running out of road and out of options at the same moment. What neither man said, because neither of them had any way yet of knowing it, was that both of those things were about to turn out to be partly true, and that the real answer was worse and stranger and more urgent than either version. Emory didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was worry for the baby, and that was true as far as it went. But there was something else keeping him upright at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, something he didn't have words for until he found himself walking out to the barn in his coat and boots at midnight, flashlight in hand, to check on a horse who had absolutely no medical reason to need checking on. Isolde was standing at the fence, the exact same spot, facing the exact same direction, out past the fence line toward the tree break that marked the edge of his property and the start of Old Man. Pruitt's overgrown back acreage, land that hadn't been grazed or mowed in going on 4 years. She didn't bow that night. She just stood there, ears forward, so still that Emory found himself holding his own breath to match her, the way you do around something that seems to be listening for a sound you can't hear yourself. He went back inside sometime around 1. He would come to regret, more than almost anything else in his life, not walking those extra 100 yards to the tree line that first night, though he would also come to understand, once he knew everything, that it likely wouldn't have mattered yet, not that night. The part of the story hiding out past that fence wasn't ready to be found yet either. It was, in its own small and terrible way, still holding on by itself. By the 3rd morning, Isolde was bowing again, same spot. Same low sound, though quieter now, worn down at the edges, like something running out of a resource it didn't have much of to begin with. Emory walked out expecting, almost hoping, to find nothing. Some trick of grief or memory in an animal who'd lost her own foal a lifetime ago, and might, in some way he couldn't measure or prove, be reliving that loss every time she caught a certain scent on the wind. He found nothing. Just wet grass, and a mare who would not stop bowing to it. He mentioned it to Idris Calloway, the vet who'd looked after his horses for going on 15 years, when Idris came out that Thursday to do fall vaccinations. Idris was a big, unhurried man who moved around horses like he had all the time in the world, which was, Emory had always figured, half the reason horses trusted him. Idris crouched by the spot Emory pointed out and ran his palm flat over the grass, the way he might check the ground for a hidden hole or a burrow. He said it could be grief. Mares who've lost a foal sometimes fixate on a location, a smell, a piece of ground that carries some trace they can't let go of. He said it could also be something buried, an old carcass, a dead animal decomposing under the surface, something with a scent strong enough to override a horse's better judgment for weeks at a time. He said the thing that stuck with Emory hardest, though, almost as an afterthought while packing his kit back into the truck. He said Isolde wasn't acting like a horse in grief. Grief made horses quiet, made them stop eating, made them stand apart from the herd with their heads low. Isolde was eating fine. Isolde was still herding the younger geldings around the pasture like she owned the county. Isolde only did this one thing, this one specific bow at this one specific hour, and Idris said, in the flat, careful voice of a man who didn't like the sound of his own theory, that in 30 years of practice he'd only ever seen that particular kind of fixation in one other context, and that was a mare guarding something living. He talked, standing there with one boot up on his truck's rear bumper, about a breadmare operation he'd consulted for once in his younger years, where a mare separated from her newborn foal by a fence line had pushed against that fence every single night for a week, not from panic, but from something closer to routine, showing up at the same hour, standing the same distance, as if her body had built a schedule around a duty that hadn't actually gone anywhere. He said a horse's sense of smell was built to find things a human nose would never manage in 100 years. Blood, birth fluid, the particular chemistry of something alive, and struggling to stay that way, carried on wind from 100 yards off if the conditions were right. He said he wasn't a man who believed in anything he couldn't put a name to, but that he also wasn't a man who was going to stand in Emory's pasture and tell him a horse acting like that, for that long, at that exact hour, every single day, was nothing. Emory didn't sleep well after that either. What he didn't know, standing in his pasture, turning Idris's words over in his head, was that 140 yards past the fence, in a shallow depression where Pruitt's overgrown field dipped down toward a dry creek bed, something had, in fact, been alive there the entire time. Something that had been alive there for 3 nights running, kept from freezing by nothing anyone in the county would have thought to credit. A half-ton mare who left her own pasture every night after Emory's porch light went dark and lay down in the tall grass a stone's throw from the fence, close enough to press her body heat against a barrier of brush and bent grass stems that no human eye had thought to look behind. Nobody had gone looking, because nobody had any reason yet to think there was a second child at all. That changed on the fourth night, though not because anyone finally understood what Isolde was doing. It changed because a storm rolled in off the ridge 2 counties west, the kind of front that Kentucky gets maybe twice a winter, driving the temperature down 11 degrees in under 2 hours and bringing with it a hard, sideways rain that turned the pasture to soup by 10 o'clock. Emory was out checking the horse's shelter when he saw Isolde standing at the fence again in the downpour, unmoving, refusing every attempt he made to walk her into the barn, planting all 4 feet and staring past him toward the tree line, like the barn itself was the thing that didn't matter. He got a lead rope on her. She let him clip it to her halter without resistance, which was its own kind of wrong, because Isolde had opinions about lead ropes and always had, and a horse that stopped arguing about something it usually argued about was a horse telling you something in the only language it had. He walked her 10 feet toward the barn. She stopped. He pulled. She planted her feet in the mud and turned her head back toward the fence and made, low in her chest, the same sound he'd heard the first morning, except quieter now, and somehow worse for being quieter, the sound of something running out of whatever reserve it had been drawing on all week. He stood there a long time in the rain with the rope slack in his hand, soaked through his coat, watching the horse refuse a warm, dry barn on the coldest night of the month to stand facing a fence line that had, as far as he could tell with a flashlight and 40 years of farm instinct, nothing behind it at all. He told himself it was grief, the way Idris had half suggested. He told himself horses did strange things, that 8 years of knowing an animal didn't mean you knew what was happening behind its eyes on any given night. And he went inside, finally, without her, because there was nothing else left to try, and because some cautious, frightened part of him didn't want to know yet what the alternative explanation might be. It was Garrett Voss, of all people, who put the pieces together, and not through any brilliant deduction, but because a piece of information finally reached him that should have arrived days earlier. A missing persons report, filed 2 counties over, for a 19-year-old girl named Sunniva Bellwether, last seen 9 days prior, 7 months pregnant. After leaving the home of a boyfriend her family had been trying for months to get her away from. The report noted, almost in passing, that Sunniva's last known text message to her older sister, sent from a gas station 40 minutes from Willow Creek, said only that she was close, that she'd find somewhere safe, and that she was sorry. Sunniva's sister would tell Garrett, in the same phone call, things that hadn't made it into the missing persons file, because a 19-year-old girl doesn't always tell her family everything until she's already gone. That Sunniva had spent the better part of a year telling herself the boyfriend's temper was something she could manage, the way you manage weather, by learning its patterns and staying out of its path. That she had started keeping a bag packed in her closet sometime in her second trimester, not because she had a plan yet, but because some animal part of her already understood she would need one. That the last time her sister had spoken to her, 3 weeks before she disappeared, Sunniva had said only that she thought something was wrong with the way he'd started talking about the baby, like it belonged to him in a way that had nothing to do with love, and her sister, not knowing yet how much weight to give a comment like that, had told her to be careful and let it go. 7 months pregnant. Which meant, if the timeline held, she'd have been carrying at least into her 32nd or 33rd week when she disappeared. Which meant, as the county nurse who'd first examined Wren pointed out when Garrett called her that night with the update, that a baby born that early, in the open, in a Kentucky November alone, would explain a great deal about the child's low weight and the danger she'd been in when Isolde found her. It also meant though nobody had said this part out loud yet, that a girl running from something bad enough to make her disappear into open country in the last stretch of a pregnancy might not have been carrying just one baby. Twin pregnancies ran in some families the way red hair did, quietly, for generations, waiting for the right combination to bring them forward. Nobody knew yet whether Sunniva Bellwethers did. Nobody had thought to ask. What Emory learned, piecing it together over the following 2 days from a conversation with Garrett, a conversation with the hospital, and a phone call to Sunniva's sister that left him sitting on his porch steps for a long time afterward with the phone in his lap, was this. Sunniva had gone into labor alone, in the dark, somewhere on or near Pruitt's overgrown acreage, likely having walked as far as she could manage before her body simply would not let her walk any farther. She delivered outside, in weather already dropping toward freezing, with no one to help her, and by every account of a girl who'd never so much as held a friend's newborn, no idea what she was doing or what was happening to her body as she did it. She believed, her sister would later say, Sunniva told her weeping from a hospital bed 40 miles away, that the second baby hadn't survived, that in the panic and the blood and the cold and the dark, she had made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life, wrapping the baby she believed was breathing in the only dry cloth she had, a flannel shirt that had belonged to the boyfriend she was running from, and carrying that one child the last quarter mile toward the only lit window she could see, Emory Castellan's porch light, before her body finally gave out on her 20 yards short of the fence, in the dark, where nobody would find her until nearly a full day later, hypothermic, hemorrhaging, unconscious in the brush, not 40 yards from where her daughter lay wrapped in a stranger's shirt. She had never gone back for the second baby. She had believed, with a particular merciless certainty of shock and blood loss and cold, that there was nothing left to go back for. What she did not know, could not have known, lying unconscious in a ditch while a search she didn't know was happening moved in slow circles around her, was that a mare with her own history of loss had found that second child before the cold could finish what the night had started, and had made a decision that no vet, no rancher, no biologist studying 100 years of equine behavior could fully account for, except to say that horses are animals built at the deepest level of their nervous systems to protect the smallest and most helpless thing in their environment, and that Isolde denied that instinct once years ago on a breeding farm 2 states away, had apparently been waiting a very long time for the world to give her another chance to use it. The 5th morning was the one that broke the case open, though it very nearly went the other way entirely. Emory woke before dawn to a sound he'd never heard Isolde make before, sharper than the low bowing moan of the last 4 mornings, closer to a scream, the kind of sound that brings every person on a farm upright in bed at the same instant, with their heart already hammering before their mind catches up to why. He ran out into weather that hadn't fully cleared from the night's storm, the ground still standing in half-frozen puddles, and found Isolde not at the fence this time, but through it, on the wrong side in Pruitt's field, standing over a spot in the tall wet grass with her head down and her whole body rigid, making that sound over and over into the brush at her feet. He would say later that his first thought, God forgive him, was that she'd finally lost her mind, that 8 years of history and 1 strange week had tipped over into something he'd have to call the vet about in a different, sadder way than he'd meant when he called Idris the first time. His second thought arrived half a second later, the way it always seemed to on that farm that week, arriving before he'd given his body permission to believe it. Something in the grass at Isolde's feet was moving. He would tell people later that the 4 seconds it took him to cross what remained of the distance between the fence and that spot in Pruitt's field were the longest 4 seconds of his life, longer than the run to the first baby, because this time he already knew, with a certainty that had nothing rational behind it and everything true behind it, exactly what he was running toward and exactly how many days it had already been out there in the cold. What he found when he dropped to his knees and ground, so wet it soaked through to his skin in an instant, was a second infant, smaller than the first had been, tangled in a nest of flattened, matted grass that had clearly been slept in, night after night, by something considerably larger than a 5-pound baby. The child was cold, frighteningly, dangerously cold. But when Emory got his bare hand against the small chest beneath a covering of leaves and grass that some instinct somewhere had arranged there, he felt a heartbeat, faint, erratic, but there. The paramedics who arrived 19 minutes later, the same crew that had come for the first baby 5 days earlier, would later tell Idris Calloway, who told Emory, who told absolutely no one else for a long time, because he wasn't sure he trusted himself to say it without his voice breaking, that a baby exposed to the temperatures that Field had seen over the previous 4 nights should not, by any figure they'd ever been trained on, have still been alive. Not without shelter, not without another source of warmth close enough and consistent enough to matter. The grass Emory found the baby nested in, when he thought about it later, in the flattened, packed-down shape of it, in the way it circled the child on 3 sides, like a windbreak built by something that understood, on whatever level a horse understands anything, exactly what a body that small needed to survive a Kentucky November, was shaped exactly like the place where a half-ton animal lies down every night to keep something warm against her own body heat until morning. The second baby was a boy. The hospital, working now from a name Garrett Voss, had finally been able to attach to the case. Called Sunniva's sister that afternoon with news that made the woman, by her own account, drop the phone twice before she could hold it steady enough to hear the rest of it. Sunniva Bellwether woke up in a hospital bed in Willow Creek Regional, 4 days after Emory found her daughter and 2 days after paramedics carried her, unconscious and hypothermic, out of the same overgrown field where her son had spent 5 nights alive in a nest of grass a mare had built and rebuilt for him each night, without a single soul on that farm understanding what she was doing until the 6th day forced the truth up out of the ground where it had been hiding since the storm. The first thing Sunniva asked, before she asked about herself, before she asked what county she was in or how long she'd been unconscious, was whether either of her children had lived. When the nurse told her there were 2, that both had lived, that one had been found by a rescue horse the very morning she was born, and the other had survived 5 nights in the open because that same horse had refused to let him die, Sunniva didn't say anything at all for almost a full minute. Then she asked, in a voice the nurse would describe to Emory weeks later as barely more than breath, whether she could see the horse. Emory brought Isolde to the hospital parking lot himself. 3 weeks later, once Sunniva was strong enough to be wheeled to a window on the 2nd floor, because there was no version of hospital policy that was going to let a horse inside a maternity ward, and because he understood, in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent that week the way he had, that some vets don't care about policy. Isolde stood in the November cold in the hospital parking lot for 11 minutes, while a girl she had never met and would never formally meet pressed her palm flat against a 2nd-story window 3 stories up, looking down at the animal who had, by every measure anyone could offer, saved both her children with nothing but instinct, body heat, and a stubbornness that had once, years before, on a different farm, been given no foal to spend itself on. Sunniva didn't cry at first. She would tell Emory much later, on one of her visits, that she'd expected to, had braced for it, the whole elevator ride down to a window low enough to see the parking lot properly. And instead, what came over her was something closer to stillness, a kind of quiet she hadn't felt since before any of it started, since before the boyfriend and the packed bag and the 9 days of walking. She said watching Isolde stand there in the cold, patient, unhurried, exactly the way a mother stands when she is finally allowed to stop worrying, was the first moment she let herself believe that she and her children were actually finally going to be all right. Wren and her brother, whom Sunniva named Robin 2 days after she woke. When the nurses told her the story of the wrens nesting near the spot where their sister had been found, went home with their mother the following spring, once the county had finished its long, careful work of making sure home was somewhere safe this time. Sunniva Bellwether did not go back to the boyfriend whose flannel shirt had wrapped her daughter through the coldest night of her short life. She went, instead, to live 40 minutes away with her sister, close enough, she told Emory once, on one of the visits she made out to the farm every few months for years afterward, close enough to bring the twins out to see the mare who had, in her words, decided to be their mother for 5 nights, before anyone else even knew they existed. Isolde never bowed to anything else on that farm again. Not once in all the years that followed, not to grain, not to a stranger, not to any of the other horses that came and went through Emory Castellan's gate. Whatever had been asking something of her that November, whatever old debt an animal carries without language for the thing it lost, it seemed, as far as anyone on that farm could tell, to have finally been paid. The only mark that was ever left of it, the one thing Emory refused to let the grass grow back over, was a low ring worn into the earth along the north fence line, the exact shape and size of a mare's body settling down to sleep over and over through the coldest week of a Kentucky November, beside 2 children the rest of the world hadn't found yet.